I'd like to welcome everyone to this presentation. I'm Selena Ngozi Esakawu, and this presentation is about growing food as activism, why food sovereignty is essential in addressing racial inequities. So I wanted to start with why grow food? There are a variety of different reasons people grow food and raise livestock. It could be for enjoyment purposes, relaxing. Maybe it is your business. Maybe you're a farmer. It's possible that you grew up growing food. It may be integral to your health or your spiritual practices. But whether you grow your own food, buy it in grocery stores or at farmers markets, or even pick it up at a food pantry, it's integral to how we live. While access to food may be convenient for some, the food system that supports this is really complex. Issues within the food system usually get discussed under the realm of food justice, food sovereignty, and food activism. This can be described as actions that address and or change inequities in the food system. There are three main categories that these issues get put under, and that is how food is produced, who produces it and how it's sold, access to land, and food. The short list that I have here has different things like food insecurity or food apartheid. I prefer the term food apartheid instead of food deserts. And food apartheid, for those who are less familiar, is when communities lack nutritionally dense foods related to systemic issues and oppression of marginalized people. This term has been popularized by Karen Washington. According to Feeding America in 2018, 37 million people were food insecure, which means to lack consistent access to food. Also on this list, you'll see that people are concerned with the environmental issues related to farming practices, unethical treatment of animals. There's also a lack of support for small scale growers. Many federal farm subsidies go to large scale farmers, which grow commodity crops, which tend to be GMO, such as corn, soy, and cotton. There's also a history of discriminatory lending by banks and government. The famous case, Pickford versus Glickman, was a class action lawsuit alleging racial discrimination against black farmers by the USDA. Black farmers have been awarded $2 billion regarding this case. Over the years, the government has denied black farmers loans, which led to black land loss, and many black farmers were not able to continue farming. There are also issues regarding the disproportionate representation of people within the food supply chain, and there have also been exclusionary policies and permits that restrict land usage based on race. The Japanese internment camp comes to mind, where many Japanese people lost their access to their land and could not farm. And then a huge issue is the dispossession of land use for and by indigenous people. I also have a poster here on the side just to provide an example of what food activism can look like. So, in the case of the Delano grape strike and boycott of the 1960s through the 70s, a couple of groups united to support migrant and immigrant farm workers. It was led by Larry Itliong, and he organized with Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez to ensure that the field workers were getting fair pay and better treatment. For this presentation, I'll be focusing primarily on the intersections of food and racial and economic inequities. So I really wanted to highlight this effort in the 1960s and 70s by migrant and immigrant farm workers that really sparked national attention to what was happening in the fields and within the food system, because these are the laborers that are prepping and producing the food that we end up buying in the grocery store. Regarding access, this is who can buy and consume fresh and nutritionally dense food. We have to discuss the disparities related to race and income. I wanted to bring in the social determinants of health. We see that food is an indicator of health outcomes for an individual. Limited access to nutritious, healthy food limits one's health and well being. If we look at overall food insecurity, we see that Fort Worth has almost 19% of its population experiencing food insecurity. That's higher than the US. Texas is also above average, so there's a lot of work that can be done. The populations that experience the highest rates of food related illnesses such as diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, and obesity are Black and Latinx folks. When it comes to income and poverty, Black, Latinx, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander groups make about $50,000 a year when white and Asian folks make about $25,000 more. Almost 20% of the Black and Latinx communities are experiencing poverty, higher than any other racial group. This is a huge factor concerning who can buy that local, organic, fresh food, or who can travel outside of their community to shop at a store with produce. 25% of the local population has to travel over 1 mile to a grocery store, and nearly 40% of the people have low income and low food access. I also wanted to include the number of community gardens in the area. This is one example of the efforts that are being made to increase access to fresh food, local fresh food options in Fort Worth. I also wanted to include an overview of food production. This is only one sliver of our food system, but an important one. These are the people that are growing our food. These are the people who have access to land to produce our food. So, in doing a really brief overview, if we look at how food is produced, at least on a large scale, that's the food that tends to go into our grocery stores. The crop production side of it, less than 1% is certified organic crops, and it varies depending on what the product is that's being grown. Monocropping and tillage is still a practice that is being utilized primarily. However, a lot of people are really promoting using cover crops, no and low till. So there are shifts in changes happening on a larger scale that are better for the environment and reduce soil degradation. And then also, there's still a dependency on chemicals and fossil fuels, which obviously that impacts our air, the land, and water supply. In regards to livestock, feedlots and factory farms still are the way to go when it comes to producing our animal protein. And if I'm not mistaken, Texas has the highest concentration of cattle feedlots in the nation. The dairy and eggs make up most of the organic livestock specialties. And then antibiotics and hormones are in heavy use as well for livestock. And the more recent data that I found with the USDA, they are actually advocating for limited use of antibiotics because they found an adverse effect with antibiotics. The more that we consume meat and the more that the animals are being treated with antibiotics can make them resistant to certain pathogens, but can also increase antibiotic resistant pathogens. So it can be a little dangerous. Now, in thinking about who produces the food, wages for farm workers on average are about $14 per hour. Managers tend to make $25 per hour. These are national numbers. And then nationally, white farmers make about $351 million compared to people of color or farmers of color, which made about $8 million. And those statistics come from a study from 2017. And then about 50, more than 50% actually, of the farm workers are undocumented or actually prison labor. And then the average age of your farm worker is 35 years or older. So I have a graph here to provide a visual of who our farm workers are and who our managers are. So as far as female identified folks, you see the statistics are fairly low when it comes to women being a part of the industry. This is still a white dominated industry. However, when it comes to white males, they tend to be the managers versus the farm workers, the ones that are working in the field on a daily basis. Black farmers tend to be the lowest, Black and Asian farmers actually. And Black farmers make about 3% of the farm workers and 3% of the managers. As far as Latinx folks, we have a higher percentage of them being our farm workers. And we do have at least a significant portion of them being managers in the industry. And so, access to land, which is extremely important. We have increased urban development, so there is less rural space to develop farms, to raise livestock, and so urban agriculture is definitely on the uptick as far as growing food locally is concerned. And then farm landowners tend to be 90% white owned and operated. And you'll find that if a farmer of color is in the business, they tend to be a tenant farmer or owner, so they're renting their land versus actually owning the property. And then as far as access to education, youth programs, the majority of the students and the educators are white males. And then in a 2017 study, agricultural degrees awarded were 75% white, 8% Hispanic slash Latinx, 3.5 Black, and actually 42% were white females. So the white females make up the majority of population as far as white people are concerned in regards to farming. So if we examine what's happening in the community and what is happening at the production level, we see that there are more disparities there as well. And from how I look at it, that there's a correlation with who is profiting in this industry, who has access to land, who grows it, and who is actually not able to access it within the communities, right? We have white people who are on the ownership and who have access to it. And then we have Black and Latinx people who may be in the industry. However, when it comes to the community level, they are still suffering from food related illnesses or in communities where they have limited access to the food. Many disparities in representation within the food system today are a result of events from decades, even centuries ago. These are just a few related to separating people of color from the land, limiting access for them to grow food for their communities, and limiting their access to cultural practices related to land. And also, these policies and events perpetuated a negative association with farming. So we have land as a commodity. If we think back to the early European settlers, these are people who experienced feudalism and oppression within their home country. They had limited access to land ownership, very few opportunities for social mobility. And so, in immigrating to the US, the land became a commodity and used for investment and trade. Over the centuries, we know that this perpetuated the genocide of indigenous communities, especially as settlers moved westward. The indigenous communities had limited access to the lands that they were able to steward for over a millennia. There were also policies that dispossessed groups of people from their property and land access. Japanese folks were interned during World War II. During this period of time, the Japanese and Japanese American population produced 40% of the produce on the West Coast. And then after internment, only about a fourth of them returned back to farming. They no longer had the land that they worked so hard to have and to work. And then here I have mentioned again the Pickford case. We also have discriminatory and racist policies that restricted access to land ownership, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Bracero Program. And there's also the Social Security Act from FDR. The Social Security Act of 1935 the coverage about excluded from coverage about half of the workers in the American economy. Among the excluded groups were agricultural and domestic workers, a large percentage of whom were African Americans. So many people consider that to be a racist policy and also is part of the reason that so many black farmers were disenfranchised and ended up losing their land. There was just very little opportunity for them to um, be supported in growing food and land ownership financially by the federal government. We also have forced labor on the land and slavery. And then we have the land consolidation and capitalization. If we look back to the 1940s with during the New Deal era, we find that this was really the time where the federal government favored large landowners and many of the smaller landowners were edged out and were not supported. And so minority farmers decreased by 14% from 1930 to 1950. Despite these efforts to disenfranchise people, some Black people use food to support their liberation of oppressive systems. Land was extremely important, not only to Black people, but for many people, especially right after emancipation. Being a farmer was one of the few occupations Black people had access to, Black men in particular. And so they valued land so much to the point where they started communities on land. They gathered up as much money as they could, maybe with a few different families, and they bought land and created their own communities. And so around 1910 to 1920, that was the height of Black land ownership. Black people owned about 14 million acres of land in the US. And by the 1980s, Black people had lost about 98% of that. And so there is this long history of connection to the land with Black people, of independence, resistance, and also the story of land loss and disconnection. So I wanted to highlight some of the forebears in this movement as far as reconnection to land and farming is concerned for Black people. So we have Harriet Moses Tubman, which many people are familiar with. She escaped enslavement. She worked in the Civil War as a nurse, a spy, a cook. She worked in the quote unquote Underground Railroad as a conductor and advocated for women's suffrage. So, in the Underground Railroad, it's a fictional underground, but it was a way to transport Black enslaved people from the South up to the North. And so, history/legend tells it that she rescued about 70 to 300 enslaved people. It was really amazing. And in order to do this, she had to understand the land. She had to understand herbs. So she was an herbalist, she was a forager, and she helped remedy infections and diseases. She knew what herbs to give to babies and to children to keep them from crying as they were on their way up to the north. And obviously, she used those skills too during the Civil War when she had to nurse Black soldiers back to health. And then we have George Washington Carver. He was born into slavery and he was an agricultural scientist. Many people associate him with the peanut. However, he did many things and invented so many things related to agriculture and beyond. So he was an early adopter to crop rotation. And this is at the same time where industrial farming was beginning to boom. And so he advocated for crop rotation and cover crops with legumes to reduce soil depletion. For those of us who know how to grow, we know that legumes is really good for fixing nitrogen, and we need the nitrogen in our soil for many things to grow. And so he really was at the forefront of that movement. He studied ways to increase yield. Um, he actually promoted alternative cash crops. And then he distributed information on recipes for these crops. And he promoted foraging when food rations were low during World War II and published his own manual for this. And he promoted health and well-being. Next, we have Fannie Lou Hamer. I can't say enough about these people and especially Fannie Lou Hamer. So, she was a Mississippi sharecropper, a civil rights activist, field organizer. Luckily, there is more and more information about Fannie Lou Hamer, and people are really saying her name and using her as inspiration within the Black food movement. She founded the Freedom Farm Corporation in 1967, and this was a community based initiative um, which really fostered rural and economic development for not only Black farmers. She welcomed anybody who was displaced. And so with this cooperative, farmers, growers had access to housing, healthcare, employment, education, access to healthy food. And what she did, she started a pig bank. And so she was like, if you had a pig and a garden, you can be self reliant. And the whole idea was to be dependent from these oppressive and racially hostile environments that she was exposed to. And then lastly, we have Booker T. Watley. He worked in aquaponics. He originated sweet potatoes and grapes. He researched biomass fuel and he wrote scientific papers. I think he has every degree under the belt. A PhD from Rutgers, an amazing individual that I'm still learning more about. So, his claim to fame was his manual on how to make $100,000 farming on 25 acres. And there is an interview that you can find online with Mother Earth News. I think it's in the 80s, maybe early 80s, with him laying out his whole plan. And his plan consisted of growing a mix of berries and sweet potatoes, greens, peas, honey, and incorporating honeybees instead of the commodity crops that were being perpetuated. Even in the 80s, a lot of large scale farmers were starting to grow or have been growing wheat and corn. And so he was like, you can grow on a small plot of land as long as you're growing something that's, if you're growing something that's diverse that people want to buy, you're in a better position than growing on small acreage and growing a lot of corn. You just aren't going to be able to make enough to sustain yourself. So he was really about economic development. His plan was for the farmer to have a year-round income, and he also perpetuated this membership club and pick your own. And the pick your own membership, which some people would consider a CSA today, would actually fund the farm itself. So he is somebody who we don't talk about often when we talk about some of these ways to engage in the food system alternatively, but he was really at the forefront of this movement, as well as these other people that I mentioned. Those folks promoted economic development, close connection with the land, and believed that the land was integral to the resiliency of their community. And so now I wanted to highlight a couple of different organizations that I feel like are working towards food sovereignty. Now, food sovereignty is related to control over the food system by a community. And this can look a variety of different ways, but basically, it's having control and access to grow your food locally, being able to buy and sell it to support yourself, your community, and future generations. And so we have Soulfire Farm. I did an immersion there in 2018. I feel like the space is really special. There's a lot of information on Soulfire Farm and Leah Penniman, who is the co-founder. It's in a rural community in upper state New York. They emphasize Afro-Indigenous regenerative practices, and this is a space where Black, Indigenous people of color can be immersed in culturally relevant growing practices that support the earth and healing generational trauma. They have a variety of different programs. And so, again, there's plenty of information out there on Soulfire Farm. So you can explore them further. Then we have the Grow House. I spent a lot of time there during my permaculture design course while I lived in Colorado. And this space is also very special to me. They created an aquaponic and hydroponic system in a greenhouse to grow in a community amidst the land and air pollution. This community is also combating gentrification and infrastructure that challenges the Latinx community that lives there. It was a space where leaders could teach workshops, sell goods, and food in the market that was attached to the greenhouse. Unfortunately, the grow house, the building is actually unstable, and they aren't able to continue operations as they were before. And so currently they're figuring out what the next phase of the grow house will look like. And then moving on to the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. I had the pleasure to visit D-Town Farms, which is a part of the network, and it's a beautiful place to see. It's a 7-acre urban farm. They focus primarily on Black people having access to the food and education to grow the food. And then it is really important for them to also incorporate economic development. So they sell the produce and they are actively working on creating a food cooperative. And many of the leaders in the network are associated with national Black food leaders to encourage other folks of color to get engaged in the food movement. There are many efforts happening on a national level, and I would like to highlight local initiatives engaged in food activism. Grow Southeast is an organization that is working with the community in the area to create urban farms where producers can increase food accessibility and sell at farmers markets. The Southside Community Gardens, which started this past year, are helping people build garden plots in their backyards who live primarily in the 76104 zip code, which is experiencing food apartheid. Their goal is to make food as accessible as possible. The people who have the plots are actually partnered with other growers. So there is this beautiful exchange of knowledge and experience with this project. There's also the Oak Cliff Veggie Project that is working to end food apartheid in the Oak Cliff area where I'm from. They are building gardens as well and distributing food to help people in the community and are also engaging community members and growing in a multitude of ways. They have a collaborative approach working with other gardeners of color in the area as well. Then we have the Tarrant County Food Policy Council. This is an advocacy group that supports local gardeners, small scale producers, urban farmers, reducing food waste, and supports healthy food options for youth. It's important to note that food is political. Food activism can show up in a lot of different ways, and there is more than one way we can address racial inequities in our food system. By dismantling the institutional and structural racism that has created impoverished communities and the health disparities as discussed earlier in the presentation, by having more Black and Brown people in leadership roles in agriculture, by changing policy that limits local food production and commerce, by having safe spaces for them to connect to land based practices on their terms, and by having the opportunity for them to have ownership over their local food system and economic growth. If we can work on these initiatives, then we can start working towards food sovereignty. And now, here are ways for you to support food activism and engage in the food movement if you are not already engaged in some of these efforts. You can donate to a nearby pantry or food bank, especially with COVID. Food is of the essence. There are a lot of opportunities to volunteer and to donate food for emergency food purposes. Educate yourself. You can learn about the food system, learn where your food is coming from. You can join a food policy council or a board in your area that's concerned about food access, or maybe you're trying to start a community garden. Shop at your local farmers market. It doesn't matter what you're able to buy, even if it's just buying a couple of tomatoes in the summertime, the farmers will love you for that. And I guarantee you they'll taste 10 times better than the tomatoes you buy in the grocery store. And then you can grow your own food if you're not engaged in a community garden or not growing in your backyard or in your windowsill. Look at opportunities to grow or even drop off your veggie scraps at a compost here at HSC. You can drop off your compost here. And then you can also financially support organizations that are engaged in food activism. And I always encourage people to save your own seed if you're able to. There's a lot of importance in having local seed that is adapted to our climate. And if you are saving seeds, you can drop them off or exchange them at local seed banks. And there is a seed bank at the Arlington Library, the Southwest branch. And then there's also a seed bank that I started at Black Coffee in Stop Six, right next to Texas Wesleyan. So, those are just a handful of ways to get engaged. If you are interested in exploring food justice, food sovereignty, and food activism further, here are some resources that I would recommend that are directly related to some of the information I provided in this PowerPoint. In the list of videos, I did include a link to the Indian farmer protest. It's a short video that describes what's happening now. It is very relevant on an international level with farming practices and the impact on the people who are growing food, and is directly connected to the Green Revolution that was started in the US in the 1960s. So please explore that further if you have the opportunity to. Here are a list of books that I find that are really helpful in understanding the depth of the food system and injustices that are within it. And here are some links that provide up to date information about what is going on in various sectors of the food movement. Here is a reference list for the sources that I cited during the presentation. Last but not least, here is the contact information for HSC Sustainability. We have the email and the phone number. Please like us and follow us on Instagram and Facebook for more details about what we're doing on campus to promote sustainability. It's my pleasure to have worked for the community garden for almost 2 years. I'm very happy to have been a part of HSC Sustainability. Thank you again for listening to the presentation.